recently you've known that the worm is out. That's the insignia. We're back to the NASA meatball, the mission insignia. We manned up a half hour earlier than crews normally do. Since we had a short launch window, we agreed to go out a half hour earlier to allow us to work any crew equipment problems we could conceivably have. And that helped because we had trouble getting the hatch closed. The weather was trying not to cooperate, but ultimately it did. And I believe it was about 40 minutes late. We got the engines ignited, the boosters lit off, and we're on our way. I've never flown or launched through a cloud. You'll see here in a second we go into a cloud, and that's not beyond our flight rule limitations. We have flight rules that govern the types of clouds we can fly through and coverages, and it all met those criteria. One of the interesting things going through a cloud, it really lights up. You get all of the light reflected back from the SRBs, and as I said, the first time I've ever done it. Not only that, you can feel the heat from the SRBs radiated back in the cockpit, so you felt kind of a little warm blast as you went through the cloud. Beyond that, the roll worked fine. First stage went as designed, and in fact, the whole ascent was really good. We launched at such a time of day with the low sun angle that I think probably you get a chance to see the SRBs separate and tumble, although we don't have a lot of it in the movie, but for the spectators watching the SRBs tumble away was pretty impressive because of the sun lighting them up as well as it did. Second stage had a little bit of vibration, and that's generally dependent upon the type of payload you have and where it's located in the payload bay. And we got up on the orbit in fine style with 7 people, 6 of them being experienced, getting established. The post-insertion on orbit went very quickly. Here we're going over, you can see the Florida Keys and over down towards the Bahamas. And it was, the first day was essentially just getting established on orbit, which went very fine. Here's your chance to meet the crew. Obviously that's me. There's Kevin, first rookie, or the only rookie on the flight, so it was a new vehicle with a new pilot. Bruce and his Coast Guard allegiance. There's Pierre. Rick Heeb, both of who set record EVAs. Kathy, who's got the record for the women for the longest EVA. And Tom, who has got over 16 hours in 2 EVAs.
Well, the rest of the crew hit the ground running on day 2. Bruce hit the ground cycling, and here on the cycle ergometer that had flown on STS-42 previously, they'd had a few problems with it, and the engineers back here at Johnson did a great job re-engineering the cycle ergometer, and we both rode it on day 2 and 3, and it just performed superbly and is queued up and ready to fly again on STS-50, our next mission. Day 4, we got up and got about the important stuff. Dan and I here working together on the rendezvous portion of the mission as we come in for our first rendezvous, and this is happiness on a rendezvous mission, is when you're about 40 miles away and look through the crosshairs in the overhead window and see that little star, which isn't a star at all. It's the Intelsat satellite lined up in the crosshairs, and we're coming in on it.
And while the folks on the flight deck are busily rendezvousing with the satellite, Rick and I and Tom were down on the mid deck getting ready to go do a spacewalk. We got pretty good at putting these electrodes on. Rick and I got to put them on, I guess, 3 times, but these are the bioinstrumentation electrodes you wear underneath our liquid-cooled garment. We're out in the payload bay now. Rick's on the left side of the screen, I'm on the right, and we're translating back aft. See the motor in the back portion of the payload bay with the yellow handrail around it. Moving out there in 0G is a lot different than moving in the water tank. It takes a much lighter touch, as we'd been told, and it took a little while for us to get used to that light touch required to translate along. And what we're doing right now is we're just doing all the preparation of the capture bar and the adapter ring in preparation for grabbing the satellite.
Now, mind you, while Rick and Pierre were out in the payload bay, Dan was still flying the approach as we came in, and at the same time juggling cameras to try to get good photo documentation of the satellite as we approached it, so we could send some live downlink through our electronic still camera to the ground to let them know how it was doing. Kathy over there at the right is up against the window shooting the handheld laser through the overhead window. As you can see, it got quite crowded on the aft flight deck. And here's the satellite as we approached it over the Gulf Coast. That's Corpus Christi below. And this final phase of the approach. On the flight deck, again, Tom with the Airflex camera to film the final approach in on the first rendezvous day. And here's the results of his work. As you can see, the satellite perched about 30 feet above the bay.
As we were getting into close proximity to the satellite, Rick was going ahead and preparing the capture bar, and Pierre went ahead and put a foot restraint attachment device on the end of the RMS. Once he got the attachment device on, he hopped on board the arm, and here you can see he's hanging by his heels as we get in closer to the Intelsat to apply the capture bar. The last part of this, after we rotated him, we rotated the arm right up into a more of a vertical position. Pierre went ahead and moved the capture bar to a horizontal and started to make his attempts to attach it.
And this is a view from the elbow camera, and I believe this is the very first attempt on the first day. And as Dan mentioned, it was a very dynamic situation, and it was something that I'm not sure we could really train for very well, particularly with hindsight. It's a very dynamic situation, and trying to put all those elements together in 1G to try to simulate 0G is very difficult, and we found that out. We also found out with that first attempt that the spacecraft was not quite as stable as we had anticipated, and the first time I touched it, it started coning off a little bit. This is another attempt on the first day, and you see in position, getting ready to put the bar on, and this time the satellite's in a little bit of a coning motion, so we were having to, I was having to con Bruce in and have him move me around quite a bit to get me in position. Had no luck with this attempt. See some motion of the arm as I try to put the bar on. And then I think what you're going to see is the last try on the second day. The first try on the second day was probably as good as we could have done it. And we actually got the bar up and got it up against the pads and actually about halved the rotation of the spacecraft, but couldn't get the latches to fire. At this point, we've got the satellite down to basically no rotation, and I tried to put the bar on using the manual fire triggers, and I just couldn't hold the bar up quite tight enough to the ring to get the manual latches to fire, or to get them to grab. And after I touched it this time, you can see the spacecraft started kind of tumbling in a little different manner, and we kind of put it in a flat spin. So now it's rotating about an axis 90 degrees from its normal spin axis. And there's a shot out the aft flight deck window of what it looked like to Dan and those guys.
You can imagine at this point we were all scratching our heads and pretty disappointed and starting to think about what was next. While in the MCC, they had the same reaction. And these are the Capcoms, and then some of the flight directors, Al Pennington and Phil Engeloff, and right away they said, well, let's start going to work seriously on what we're going to try next. And here's a Tiger team that was assembled to come up with another way to do business. And you see a lot of the engineers in one of the back rooms, and they're putting some plans together and figuring out, okay, how are we going to do it? What's next? Can we fit 3 people in an airlock? And all the questions that were addressed in those couple days. And on board, on the in-between day, we went ahead and put our suits on. There's Pierre and Tom already in the airlock. And then I was out in the middeck in the early part of this setup on my umbilical, and then tucked my feet in and sort of we folded me into the airlock along with Tom, and Pierre and Kathy came down and got the airlock closed. We just checked everything out that we could check out, and we all fit, which we were pretty happy to see that it worked that way. Once we proved that we could all fit, then the next question is, well, how exactly are we going to use these 3 people? And back on the ground in the water tank, they had 3 folks in the wet F, and you see them there and off on the left, and then in the center of the picture and to the right on the end of the arm with all the divers, and making sure that they knew what they wanted to do with 3 folks. And when they called up the plan, we were very pleased to hear how they'd set it up. And so you see here, this is how it looked on orbit, essentially the same picture. Kind of neat shot here shows the satellite coning, and you see that it's misaligned with the orbiter axis in this picture, but as it cones and wobbles around, Dan had it psyched out and lined up so that it would come and present a flat side to us every 3 minutes or so, is what it turned out to be. And we were talking among ourselves, okay, who's lined up now? You know, if Rick's lined up with his grapple point, where is it to Tom and where is it to Pierre? And so we got in agreement on exactly what the configuration was going to be when it was time to make the grab. And then it was just a matter of sitting there and waiting for it to slowly rotate around. It seemed like it was moving extremely slow. Already at this point, we had no idea how long we were going to spend holding on to it. Bruce is operating the arm in response to Pierre's hand motion, signaling up, down, left, right. And on this picture, you can see clearly Pierre motioning to Bruce to raise him up a little bit so that we'd all 3 be in position. And and slowly we came around to just the right orientation, and what I was going to say was ready, grab, and it turned into wait, let's do it. And I've concluded that's what happens when you put a civilian out there.
As you can see, the guys in the flight deck were really happy there once we made the grab, and I'm sure this is a point where all you folks on the ground, after watching us for a few minutes, were going, well, they've got it and they don't know what to do with it. And because of the wobble of the spacecraft as it came in, we ended up having to rotate it a third of a revolution around. Turns out we did that at about the same speed a minute hand moves around the clock, so it was slow. This is where all the finesse work was done, which I'm not sure everyone appreciates. Rick and Pierre very gingerly putting the capture bar on, and I never did feel it, and Bruce moving the arm within inches of the orbiter structure to get Pierre in the proper position to do that.
Once we got the capture bar installed, the next step we had to do was actually hard dock it. The capture bar just goes up, fires a couple triggers, and grabs the ring on the bottom of the satellite. From that point on, we had to maneuver Pierre underneath the satellite to where he could take a power tool and tighten up a bolt that would actually clamp the capture bar firmly to the satellite before he went to grapple it. We took the arm into places where it had never been expected to be taken before the flight, and it's a real credit to our training team, in particular the EVA trainers and the RMS trainers, that we were able to perform these tasks without a whole lot of preparation before, and we were properly trained to where we could go ahead and operate throughout the entire envelope of the orbiter and get the task accomplished. Once Pierre got the capture bar installed and hard docked, had to move him out of the way, went ahead and took him over to the sill of the orbiter and dropped him off. All this time, Tom and Rick were the two legs of the table holding the satellite up, and that was a real concern point of mine, was how good these two could stabilize the satellite for the grapple. As it turns out, was able to go over and grab the satellite, and they held it real tight, and it worked out perfect. After we had it grappled, and from that point on, it was pretty much like we trained before the flight. But once we had it grappled, Rick and Tom, and now actually Tom could help Rick and Pierre do their nominal procedures. They went back and prepared the kick motor for the actual berthing of the satellite. Meanwhile, and it goes real slow here. Matter of fact, at one point Dan said, "Can't you move that arm any faster?" But that's just the way things were. Once things started working out well for us, we wanted to speed things up and get it done. But we moved the satellite back into the hover position and went ahead and berthed it.
Once Bruce got the satellite sat down on top of the motor, Rick and I went to work with Tom's assistants, mating the clamps, the umbilicals, and the push-off springs, and that went essentially exactly the way it did in the water tank. And it was actually a big help having Tom out there, because he got to do a couple of foot restraint changes for us that actually sped things up. You can see Rick right there. He's working with the torque wrench and finishing up torquing one of the clamps on the satellite.
Our elation at having finally captured the satellite quickly turned to disappointment when we couldn't seem to get rid of it. The first 3 attempts to deploy were unsuccessful, and we were starting to think about sending somebody out in the payload bay to cut it loose and get rid of it when the ground called up a reconfiguration of power buses, and that the 4th attempt at deploy was successful. Intelsat spun out of the bay and separated from us at about 2/3 of a foot per second, and it's now in geosynchronous orbit. It's all appendages deployed, solar drum deployed. They didn't do any damage to it. It seems to be working fine. It's in the middle of its checkout and should be an operational communication satellite by the middle of July. We did let them back in after a time, although they were asking me why dinner wasn't ready when they came in. True. But in actual fact, none of us had eaten during those days.
Well, between the excitement of EVAs and rendezvous, certainly one of the most pleasurable things about spaceflight is looking out the window at this beautiful planet we call Earth. And so we took quite a few still photos we hope to share with you here in a minute. Here's a nice photo of the birth of a hurricane out over the ocean. You know, we ended up with enough gas, we determined to do one more rendezvous up there, and so we were looking for any target of opportunity. However, the ground said we didn't have quite enough to reach the moon to finish up the day. As we coast here over, you can see Cuba in this scene, the tip of Florida to the right, the Bahamas. I think the Bahamas, that area is just one of the most magnificent sights we saw up there as far as looking down on ocean scenery. Andros Island, an area called the Tongue of the Ocean there, and we've got a good still photograph of this we'll talk a little bit more about later, but really a beautiful planet we live on.
After 3 EVAs, by the morning of our 4th EVA, we pretty much had the preparation procedures down pat, and most of the crew was trained in how to do that. This is a shot of me before I got in the suit using the 0G technique of getting the air bubbles out of our water bottles that we carried in our suit, and that water and a little food stick is all the water or food we had during the time that we were outside. And really, you didn't have enough time out there. You were so busy to eat or drink. This is a shot of the middeck with the extra 2 spacesuits that we had to move out of the airlock, along with all the other gear for 7 crewmen that we had to stow and keep in order during our EVAs. Inside the airlock, one of the first things I noticed was how much more room there was in there with just Kathy and not Rick and Pierre in there with me. Bruce came in and started making suggestions that he thought he'd fit in my suit about here, and this was my response to that.
I was quite happy to get a chance to go out after having dressed them up and sent them out to play the day before. I thought it was nice that I would get a turn to do that. Climbing this pole for the first time was actually kind of a thrill. As you can see, it's moving around as I'm climbing it. I'm holding on very tightly with my hands and my feet. But in actual fact, it was very easy to do that. Movement was quite easy out there. The harder part is stopping. And I was moving slowly so that I wouldn't go squirting off the top when it came time to stop. As the Earth goes by below you, if that's all you can see, you get the sensation that you're pitching, because the scene is moving in front of you, and your body's not moving, but it sort of seems that way. We built half a bay of truss, which was half of a cube, about 14 feet on a side. Moving those members, 14 or some as long as 25 feet, was kind of interesting when you're only handling it from one end. To make the joints, the EVA joints, you had to be very precise in your positioning of the strut, and as it turns out, it was, rather than positioning it very precisely, you just sort of waited until it drifted through the right position, and if you were lucky, you could slam it in when it was just right. It was far easier to do an operation like you see here, where there was one of us on each end of a strut.
One of the Space Station Freedom Assembly tasks that we were trying to accomplish up there was to be able to mate 2 large structures. So what we did was we pulled out the MPES here with the arm, which is the multi-purpose experiment support structure. Tom and Kathy went ahead and built some legs, and then we went ahead, using voice commands only, tried to attach the legs off the MPES with the structure that they built, the big fixture back in the back of the payload bay, and tried to dock those together just using voice commands.
And this is after doing that pallet attach technique, going ahead and stowing the equipment in our toolboxes we had there on the platform, the MPES. We also did an evaluation of a crew self-rescue device called our crew propulsion device, CPD, which is designed to be used if a crew member was to become detached from space station when you didn't have an orbiter around to come and rescue you. It's a modification of the old handheld maneuvering unit we used during Gemini and Skylab days. It's a nitrogen gas device that has small jets that you can use to rotate your body and to translate. It turned out the rotation and translation worked quite well. The problem was that we saw rather quickly was in determining what direction you were rotating in the payload bay, and then to put that wand in the proper position to stop it.
Our pre-flight plan was for 2 ASIM EVAs, and on the first one, Tom and I were to build the structure, and on the second one, Rick and Pierre were to take it down. Since we were cut down to only 1 ASIM EVA, Tom and I also had to disassemble the structure.
The flight crew got tired of saying they couldn't go outside, hearing we couldn't go outside, so Dan decided to demonstrate that we were capable of, well, maybe they made the right decision not sending us outside. We had a little stress relief here after the intense mission, and on the day before coming home, we were doing a little fluid dynamics here, in this case with some Kool-Aid and lemonade droplets, and letting them float together and mix in 0 gravity, and then Bruce shows the alternative method of drinking fluids in orbit. The military members of the crew, a couple of them, of course, had to do a little close order drill while we're up there, and this has been done before, but I want to point out, you notice our feet are not touching the floor in this motion here, and that you can move like crazy up there, and you won't really translate unless you bump into anything, but you can rotate. We decided after this that the Coast Guard march is much better than the Air Force. Pierre, living out one of his Walter Mitty dreams here to one day become a magician, demonstrate a little levitation here of KT off the middeck floor. All he lacked, he said, was the hula hoop to run down the length of her body to prove there are no hidden wires or strings attached. And KT, after her hard EVA the day before, decided to show us how she prefers to unwind on orbit after a stress-filled day. I really did find that kind of difficult to relax up there. If you like to exercise or go run or whatever to relieve stress, you just didn't have that opportunity in zero gravity. So this is a well-spent day as we prepared for re-entry, and I cleaned up the ship and got her ready to come home and do the final checkouts before entry day.
Well, as the sun quickly set in the west, the mission came to an end and it was time to come home. We got to do an entry during daylight, which was really interesting. We made a low pass on Hawaii and came into the Edwards complex, landing on runway 22. We still had one primary objective left, and that was to test the drag chute. After over 3.5 million miles, we touched down, and about the time the nose gear touches down, you'll see the drag chute start out from below the horizontal tail. Right about now, there it goes. The pilot chute, the drag chute in a reef condition, it opens about halfway first and then opens full open. You really didn't feel any of the opening shock, but when it opened the full way, as you see it here, there was a significant tug in our shoulder harnesses, and we were getting about an 8 foot per second squared deceleration rate. We did that to about 100 knots, at which point we started using the brakes a little bit. And at 60 knots, we detached the drag chute, and we do that so it doesn't drape down over the engine bells. That's going to be the standard procedures at 60 knots, dropping it off onto the runway. The rollout was completed, and then, as most flights, you have about a half hour or so's worth of powering down and then reconfiguring in the cockpit, and then we're able to get out. We felt pretty good about the mission. It had been real interesting and challenging, and we're real happy with the way Endeavour performed. It performed like a real champ, which is phenomenal for the first flight of a new vehicle.